Thank you, and good evening, good afternoon to everyone who's joined us here. I think we've had quite an overwhelming response. My name is Nishan Balashanmulam. I'm the Director and CEO at GH2 India, and I'm assuming most of y'all in this webinar know who we are. We are an India-based green hydrogen network and association. We've been very active in the space, and one of the primary reasons why we are doing this is because over the last 9 to 10 months, I think green hydrogen developers have recognized this emerging opportunity in maritime. And I can tell you with full confidence that the maritime sector is also looking forward for the green fuel developers to contribute to this evolving ecosystem. So today we are looking to have a very candid conversation. This session was initially planned under the assumption that the net zero framework would be adopted, and it will be a much more exciting conversation. But we've hit some roadblocks, and I've heard that from several stakeholders, we are keeping our heads up. We are positive that this will come just with some delays. Abhinav, if you can go to the next slide. So just for everybody here to know what you can expect today. Soon after my welcome remarks and introduction, we have a presentation from the Global Maritime Forum. Following that, we'll have a panel discussion, and you see our speakers on screen. We have Aparajit Pandey, who's the principal at RMI for shipping decarbonization. Joe Williams, our partner and CEO at the Green Hydrogen Organization. We have Theo from the Mærsk Mc-Kinney Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. He's the head of climate finance and economics, and also Daniel, who's joining us from the center, and he's the head of regulatory affairs. So following this panel discussion, we'll open the floor for question and answers, and I'm sure a lot of you all have questions. And just for our experts who are joining us as panelists, thank you very much for taking your time out, joining here and offering value to all our stakeholders, and also to let you all know that as much as most of us have heard about the net zero framework, it's still a relatively new subject for us in the green hydrogen sector. So any insights, overviews you provide, we very much appreciate it. So with that, if I can welcome Femke, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'll share my own set of slides. But yeah, so there's been quite some developments in the last few weeks. So hoping to give a little bit of a different presentation here today. But you can't always control everything, and so here we are. Just to kind of really quickly recap, I'm sure you've all seen it all over LinkedIn and the media already. But the extraordinary session last week was supposed to, or was meant to adopt the net zero framework. However, the meeting's now been adjourned for a year, and so that means that it won't be adopted within the coming few months. It will be at least another year, and I just wanted to kind of highlight what that year will look like, and what that really means for us, and what that means for especially kind of how we look at the IMO and where we see kind of points of engagement and what's really important for us to focus on in the coming year. So basically, the last week, the IMO has continued its work. So the extraordinary session has been adjourned, but that doesn't mean that the work of the Marine Environment Protection Committee is completely still. That work keeps on going. And so that means that this week, the Intersessional Working Group on Greenhouse Gas Emissions, so the 20th meeting, ISWG20, they got together to start working on the guidelines. And so MMPC and the Intersessional Working Group have developed a work plan in terms of what kind of guidelines are necessary for the framework and when they need to be developed, approximately by when they need to be adopted, to make sure that the framework is ready for entry into force. And so this work still continued, because now instead of adoption first and then figuring out the details, now really the intention is, well, let's start figuring out those details and have the full framework as well as the details ready for adoption, hopefully a year from now. And so that work already started this week, and will continue until the next ISWG meeting in April, and then throughout some other MEPC meetings in the coming year, where the committee and the member states will work on adopting guidelines, for example, guidelines on the rewards, on the calculation of the global fuel intensity targets, the LCA guidelines, all really, really important guidelines that the committee and the working group will keep on working on in the coming year. And so, it's not necessarily the position where we wanted to be in, but I think it's really important for us to keep on pushing and to keep on, showing high ambition at the IMO, especially in terms of the guidelines, to make sure that everything is as ready as it can be by the time it gets adopted. So just a little bit of kind of this is what it means in terms of the timeline. And then I just want to take a little bit of a step back. And when we're looking at the guidelines and what we think is especially important is kind of, and we're looking at this from a bit of a transition perspective, right? So the transition from here to 2050 to zero by 2050 is likely to be a mix of fuels. We have different vessels, different technologies. We have your conventional vessel that can use bio drop-in. We see more and more dual fuel methanol vessels coming on the water. Dual fuel ammonia vessels are being ordered. We have our LNG vessels, and they could all use different pathways, different production pathways, different fuels. They can switch between them through retrofitting. And so there's a lot of technology pathways going forward. And ship owners will likely to have, will be facing a lot of different choices in the coming years. And so they have to consider, what production pathway, what technology pathway we're going to take. Depends on the scalability of the fuel, depends on the greenhouse gas reduction potential, how to consider the cost competitiveness of these different fuels, their availability, the value when you want to resell your vessel. So there's a lot of considerations that ship owners will need to make in the coming few years. And so what we're hoping for from Net Zero Framework is to help us kind of give some clarity. Is like give us that framework to help us figure out, or help ship owners figure out what kind of pathways they can take and how they compare with each other. And so when we look at the Net Zero Framework as it is today, this is based on total cost of ownership modeling that was done by UMass and UCL last year. And so if we look at the Net Zero Framework and we take away, we forget about the rewards, we forget about any kind of changes to the framework, just really as it is right now. So we have the penalties, we have the targets, we have the surplus unit trading. If we look at just that, the framework in itself is sufficient to eventually get to e-fuels in the long run. Around like 2047 or so, e-ammonia, so green ammonia, is likely to become the lowest cost competitive fuel in this framework, in this kind of wide scope of different fuels. And that's great, but it's insufficient to get to e-fuel offtake early on. And why it's important to get to e-fuel offtake early on is because the transition to e-fuels, where it's the most scalable fuel, it's likely where the sector is going to end up in the long run, but it needs so much time to develop. We need the fuel production on site, or we need the fuel production there. We need to have the infrastructure there. It takes a lot of time to build out, and therefore we need to start really early. And it doesn't mean that the entire sector will need to shift to e-fuels, but it means that alongside that incremental transition, alongside ship owners shifting to biofuels, shifting to potentially LNG, bio-LNG, alongside that transition, we also need a growing portion of the fleet to already start investing in e-fuels. And so we need a little bit more from the guidelines to help us do that, so that we don't just wait until 2040 to invest in e-fuels. And so if we're looking at the guidelines, really the main thing of the guidelines that can help us do that is the rewards. I think the rewards really have the main objective to look at that long-term transition, right? I think every component of the framework has their own objective. They can do their own thing. The GFI targets will help kind of push that incremental transition. It will help us get there to 2050. But the rewards is something that should focus not just on compliance, it should focus on those that go above and beyond. And what means going above and beyond? Well, it means the fuels that will help us get there in the long run. And so if we're looking at the rewards, really, I think there's two main components that we are looking for and that we're hoping to push for in the coming year. So we have the fuel eligibility on the one hand. So which fuels do the rewards actually reward? Should the rewards reward? And how should they do so? So the level setting mechanism. There's a lot of different options and a lot of different combinations on the table. But what we're looking for in the coming year is really kind of how they compare to four main considerations. How do they really perform across this framework, across this kind of way of comparing the different mechanisms? And so we have environmental effectiveness. So really, how much certainty does it give to the sector to invest in e-fuels? So that's one side. we have the cost effectiveness. So how effective is it actually? How is there price discovery? Does it help us kind of push for the lowest cost option in the best way possible? Then there's distributional considerations, which is around how easy it is to use, not just for the large ship owners, but also for the small ship owners and for different geographies, right? We don't want it to be only accessible for the European big ship owners. We want it to be accessible for all of the ship owners who are able to use these fuels. And then fourthly, not unimportant, is how feasible is it kind of from an institutional perspective? So is the IMO actually able to apply these? Is it politically feasible? Is there kind of a willingness for the member states to converge around this idea? So that's a little bit kind of theoretical of like how we should look at the rewards. And then looking at these different kind of considerations, I think that we can apply this to those two main components, right? So we have fuel eligibility, and we have the actual the actual like reward level setting mechanism in itself. If we're looking at fuel eligibility, and there's a lot on this slide, and I won't go through this, but I think what's really important from the perspective of these four considerations is to keep it very technology specific. The more technology specific your reward is, the more efficient it's going to be, because the more money you will have to spend on fewer fuels that eventually will have the largest potential to help us get to zero in the long run. And so from a fuel eligibility perspective, you can either decide, okay, well, we will reward these fuels based on their production pathway. So it's a technology-centric approach, which means you either decide you want to give your money to, say, e-fuels and biofuels that reach the Z and Z threshold. You give them to e-fuels altogether as kind of the same reward to all e-fuels, or you differentiate between different production pathways within the group of e-fuels. And I think, there's a huge benefit to all of these, but I think really if we're looking at what gives most certainty is the things that are most specific, right? Because it allows us to give more money to the fuels that really will get us there in the end. A second approach would be emission-centric. So that would be paying out the rewards based on what their actual GFI target is. Which is also a great option. I think there's a little bit of a risk from our perspective that if you do that you still end up rewarding e-fuels and biofuels in the same way. And biofuels are indeed a great option to meet the GFI targets. But what is a little bit of a tricky one with biofuels is that they are not as scalable as e-fuels, right? And they're already a little bit cheaper in the long run or in the short run. And so what happens if e-fuels and biofuels are going to be rewarded in the same way, there's a little bit of a risk from our perspective that the biofuels in the short run are going to be eating up all of the rewards, and you still delay that transition to e-fuels, whereas then 10 years from now, you're ending up in a situation where biofuels hit that scalability constraint, the prices surge, and we're still not ready to transition to e-fuels at the level that we need it to be. So a great approach, but there's a little bit of a risk in terms of kind of how they might compete with each other and how much money is actually left over for the fuels that need that technology push a little bit more and that need a little bit more help to compete with the other fuels in the short term. And then I won't go through all of this either, but just to kind of highlight a little bit of that there's a way to actually look at the reward and to look at the level setting mechanism in itself and how you set the reward. So for example, there is a way to look at it from an administrative perspective. So the IMO would be setting the reward by itself. It would be a fixed price. It's a relatively simple mechanism, right, for the rewards to be paid out. But there's a little bit of a risk where you will need to pay out more rewards than there's actually money in the fund for. So it might put the IMO liability at risk. So there's a little bit of a concern there. It also limits price discovery because there's not necessarily there's no competition in a fixed price. The other hand, we have discussed also at the IMO this week mechanisms such as auction-based mechanisms where you actually auction out fuel on the demand side, and that would really help us restrict the funds. It would help us stimulate the price discovery, but it's a little bit more complex, right? A lot of ship owners are a little bit more hesitant to participate in this kind of mechanism just because it's really quite difficult to get those terms and conditions right and actually attractive for ship owners to participate in. And this now I'm really kind of diving into the rewards, and I think there's a lot of, as an example of I think what's really, really important for us in the coming year. We heard a lot of concerns from member state. We heard a lot of concerns from industry as well, or a small portion of industry around the framework. I think what is really kind of overall important for us for the guidelines is to use the guidelines and to take away concerns that we have from countries who are currently a little bit hesitant. I think the rewards is one main bit because it's really, really important for us to get that energy transition. And hopefully, I'm not sure if other people will speak on that a little bit as well, but there's also the other part of the money that's going to be spent on a just and equitable transition. And this is also really, really incredibly critical for the IMO to hopefully come to an agreement, because there's a lot of countries that are very concerned around the impacts of the framework on their food security, on their food costs and their trade costs in general. And so having guidelines around that fund and around the revenue disbursement in place is going to be really critical as well to take away some of the concerns from developing countries and hopefully build their confidence in that the net zero framework is actually a good thing. But given that we here have a group of few producers, I think what's really, really important for us as a collective is to push for really high ambition guidelines, to push for something that is technology specific, that is competitive enough, that is actually driving that investment certainty. And that's not something that is, that still leaves ship owners a little bit in between. And that e-fuel seems too risky of a technology pathway to go for, but rather to help build that confidence in the transition and make sure that we can get to the growing portion early on in the transition. So that was really all for me in terms of the guidelines, in terms of kind of where we are. And again, I really did zoom in on the rewards quite a bit because it's really important for us, but happy to also discuss the other bits because there's many more guidelines to be discussed. And I know the center is working very, very hard on a large portion of those guidelines. So I'm sure they can highlight those a little bit better than I could.
Thank you very much. And before we jump into this panel, perhaps I want to take a few steps back into what happened last week, because we were supposed to have a different conversation. Now, in terms of the proceedings that unfolded, of course, we know the result, but there were we highlighted some of the concerns raised by some of the stakeholders. Perhaps if you are AP, you've also been there at IMO last week, and you were walking into the building when you were talking to us on one of those calls. So perhaps if you could just start with what the mood was like, and then let's go into some of the really valid reasons as to why there were concerns.
So I think to be fair, quite a few of us that are on this panel were in the room for the past 2 weeks. I think that with regards to the way that the geopolitics played out, it was something that was certainly unexpected. I think that it's fair to say that most people walked into that last week expecting for adoption. In fact, I remember having a conversation with Daniel the week before, and both of us saying, oh yes, of course it's going to pass, there's no reason for it not to. So I think it's fair to say that it was pretty unexpected that this was not adopted. I think that there are some legitimate concerns that were highlighted with regards to the just and equitable transition, some uncertainties around the guidelines, which hopefully will be tackled over the next year or so and provide more certainty for those that had legitimate questions. I think that we also need to realize that some of the concerns might have been more geopolitical or might have been more of a ideological, reason or rationale. And that also played a part in terms of why it wasn't adopted.
Femke, would you also agree that this was unexpected?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of tension already building up over the summer. Of course, the US had been making several statements and targeted threats, and we heard from more and more countries that started getting, a little bit hesitant. We were still very much optimistic going into the meeting, and that optimism definitely kind of started to fade as more and more days passed. And so towards the end, it wasn't necessarily a surprise. I think it was just there was the way it happened, I think, was quite a surprise to me. That was definitely something that we weren't necessarily that I hadn't put my money on in terms of what I thought the outcome was going to be.
No, it was a bit of a shocker for all of us here, following it from a distance and being aware of the developments over the last 10 to 12 months, it was a bit of a shocker, and especially some of our member companies, it's billions and billions of dollars on the line. And this was a threat of hope, right? In our green hydrogen sector where, there was a lot of hype and there was no offtakes, and we thought this would really turn things around, but here we are. But Daniel, Theo, what do we have to gain from this? Being on the positive side, looking into the next 12 months, right? What do you think is the path forward, and what can we do collectively as an ecosystem?
I think what this showed to me, and also because I got reactions from the wide industry on what happened, is that there were a lot of companies that were expecting this to be adopted, so they were already planning investments. They were in advanced discussions with their investors and banks and so on. Also, shipping companies who were actually putting a lot of bets into these. So there was this. That also helped to build this momentum before the meeting. That okay, this is going to get adopted. A lot of part of the industry is betting on this, and so there was this large momentum that we were seeing. But of course, it didn't happen. So because we know, it wasn't adopted, it was adjourned. The decision for adoption was adjourned. So what can we do? I think as this comes as a result we were not expecting, and maybe there would have consequences in investments and in some companies because they were expecting this to come. The thing that this tells me is that maybe we have a larger role to play than we thought we had in terms of talking to the right stakeholders in different governments, ministries, organizations, or other countries to say we need to get through adoption. I'm not trying to say guidelines are unimportant. They are important, but I think the first step is we need to get these through adoption. So what can be done is actually there's a need for collective, creation of awareness and engagement with different stakeholders at maybe a higher level in a more organized way than what was done before. Not that what was done before was not the right thing. Actually, it was the right thing, but we need to put these into a different level. Of course, there are some legitimate concerns that were voiced, and we need to listen to them. I think it's important that maybe for some regions of the world, it's normal to adopt first a high-level regulation and develop the details later on. For instance, in Europe, that's classically how it's done. They develop a more high level, and they go to secondary legislation as we go on. Maybe for what this is also telling us is that for some organizations, some member states, and some parts of the world, it's important to know the details before they can adopt such an important regulation. So the development guidelines is an opportunity to clarify those things and address the legitimate concerns or questions. And concerns are maybe not so much in terms of how it would look like. Maybe some concerns are of the like of can we do it? So, for instance, I'll just highlight fuel certification. Can IMO do fuel certification? And I believe it can, so we can demonstrate that. Or can IMO develop a registry, a complex registry of trade units, surplus, and trading these units? It sounds complicated. Yes, actually, it can. And then showcase, we have done these, and look at the AP, we have done these with RMI and the catalyst, demonstrated it actually can be done. So maybe the concern is not really what is it? It's more we'll know what it is, but can we do it on time? So I think there's an opportunity for us to use this as an opportunity to create more awareness, double down or triple down, and then address some of these concerns collectively. Theo, do you want to add?
Yeah, very briefly, if it's okay, Nishant, just to add,
Yes,
I generally Larry Ellison said, I used to think, now I just read The Economist. And I often joke, I used to think, now I just listen to Daniel. But maybe just to add, I think, let's not be naive, because many people are saying that there was this exogenous politicization of a technical process. That was never true. The IMO was already an inherently political forum. It had the interests of member states. There was horse trading. The two-tiered reduction targets reflected that. I think the degree and kind of political engagement was unexpected. And this goes to Femke's point. And so I think rather than characterizing this as a politicization of something that isn't political, I think it's just a reminder that it's going to be a political process and we should be ready for it. And this goes to Daniel's point that we don't have a defeated global decarbonization deal. We have a postponed acceptance. And in that time, we have plenty of opportunities to retire these technical questions that are totally justifiable. You know, if I'm an Indian potential producer of low emission hydrogen, I would like to know a lot more about what the ZNZ reward mechanism that Femke outlined looks like before I put my shoulder to that wheel. If I'm a small island developing state who's been told that there's a 10 billion climate finance pipeline opening, I would like to know a little bit about how that's programmed out before I get my prime minister to loudly advocate for adoption. So a year, I think, is a feature, not a bug on many of those points. Secondly, I think there's also the opportunity to get it right in the sense that many of the decisions will have long-term consequences. So just taking a potentially arcane sounding matter of how to subsidize which fuels, which Femke in her much nicer slides than we have. So we might steal some of those designs. You may see them again. You know, if we have a flat fixed rate subsidy, simple economics will tell you that the merit order of fuels that enter that curve depends a lot on their abatement costs. And we need to think quite hard about whether we want to live in a world with very cheap but potentially scalable bio abatement coming in and displacing higher cost but potentially more revolutionary low emission hydrogen, or whether we want to design a system that can do both. And this is an opportunity to get that right. And in doing so, reinforce the kind of political support for this opportunity, which is going to create a market for that. And finally, let me just say about where some of the opposition is coming from. Now, I understand the political signaling around moving towards new energy sources, but apples to apples, shipping accounts for something on the order of 4 to 5% of bottom of the barrel oil supply. This is a rounding error. If shipping is not using those units, we'll make more roads with slightly cheaper tarmac. It'll go somewhere. Of that 5%, the IMO's member states have a 5 to 10% ZNZ target of those fuels. So this is a rounding error of a rounding error, except that it provides a path to scale up for shipping in other hard to abate industries. So it's not like the proposition is let's delete fossil fuels. They're part of our technical civilization. The proposition is let's replace some of that energy with the future. And that 5% ZNZ figure I mentioned, if you then go back and crunch the numbers and look at what that would imply for scaling up low emission hydrogen based fuels, it's a whole integer multiple of the capacity that's online. So in this tiny little hole that won't change the fossil fuel picture that much in the short term, we can build a whole new industry that is whole integer multiples of the capacity that's online and provide an entry point for all the green hydrogen and other low emission fuels that we know we will need to decarbonize in the long run. So those are, I think, the 4 points to keep in mind. Let's not pretend this wasn't political. Let's use the time productively. This is a postponement, not a defeat. And if we win, we're not displacing everything. We're creating an opportunity for more jobs, future growth, and new industries.
Daniel, something you said 30 seconds ago, you sounded like the best salesman our industry could ever have, right? It's true. And thanks for giving us this wide perspective as well. Both you and Daniel have raised quite a lot of points here. But just to sum this up, I think from Daniel, we need to level up, right, in our engagements. And I think what's common between the both of you all is that awareness. That awareness has to be trickled down to all the different stakeholders across this ecosystem. And in my conversations over the last few days, I've realized that because nobody within the Indian government agencies told me it was political pressure. It was lack of awareness between stakeholders in the Indian ecosystem, not being clear about, some of these, what are the implications, the impacts, etc. And I think that's something we can all collectively address. And I think, that's where Joe could come in as well as the Green Hydrogen Organization. And, together that's something we do. The other thing I think, thanks for, highlighting the fact or drawing things into perspective. After all, it is only 5% of the 5%. And it is true that is going to really create massive opportunity for an industry to grow, and for an industry that is growing faster than solar, for an industry where government policies have come in place way before the industry has been created or scaled. Investors are pouring in billions. And, just goes back to, some of my family members questioning me, why are you starting an association for an industry that does not exist, right? And this is the kind of interest we have in the sector, and it is a promise for the future. And, what the net zero framework could have done is actually help accelerate. But the whole question on fuels, I think that's something, dear to us. We will have a deeper discussion. But before that, I want to bring in Joe. Joe, it's clear that, the one is the level of engagements. We need to, level that up. And then the awareness we draw on, some of these different aspects of the net zero framework is important. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you think we should be doing in the next 12 months?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and thanks so much for putting this together, Nish. It's obviously not what you were expecting to be talking about, but it's great that it's come together, and to see how many participants are on is actually very, very encouraging. I agree that what happened at the IMO was actually inherently political. I think we mustn't kid ourselves that it wasn't. And I do think that the sort of, let's say, the shipping decarbonization community, the guys who are really pushing for this, many of which are on this call, was not really prepared for the scenario for it not being adopted, not fully prepared, and certainly not sort of equipped to push back against some of the tactics that were used. And, I entirely agree that it wasn't only about those tactics. I think we do need to take some of those other concerns very, very seriously. And we do have the time to do it. And of course, being retrospective is very easy. But, in retrospect, there probably was a little bit too much wrangling over the detail of implementation amongst many of us in the community before this thing got over the line. And of course, we do have an opportunity now in the next year, and to really turbocharge that in the next few months, to do things differently. Ostensibly, we understand that there were sort of member states, even within the European Union, that were making this argument that we need the details before we get this thing over the line. And of course, that's overlaid by the political pressure and the geopolitics that was there as well. But I think we do have time to prepare this time, in a way that we absolutely didn't beforehand. We have 12 months. We will be better prepared next time. Equally, let's not think that the position of those that have a very hard kind of position on this is going to change, barring anything absolutely dramatic happening. Those positions are not going to change either. So how do you, in a way, begin to move the swing states, if you want to bring a sort of political analogy into this? At the end of the day, the votes that came out were, we're not too far away from each other. Swinging it slightly the other way is something which is feasible if we can address those concerns, if we can get the life cycle emissions work and the guidelines sorted. I guess one other thing I wanted to say is I really agreed with what I think Femke and frankly everyone was saying around we just can't wait until 2040 to start to scale some of these truly sustainable fuels. We can't wait 15 years and then suddenly say, oh, actually now we need some e-fuels. Like, it takes time to build the infrastructure, and it takes time to build the financing and the ecosystem around these fuels. And of course, I know a lot of you on this call are working on the green corridors and the bunkering and the net zero infrastructure that's needed to make this happen at ports and between ports, and that all takes a long time to happen. So we need that signal now. I think we do need to push back against this sense that these sort of, more sustainable fuels, green ammonia, green methanol, e-methane, as well, are sort of, experimental. I heard that word so many times in speaking to people, these experimental fuels. We need to really push back against that, that notion. And then maybe finally, just to sort of, reiterate this point around, we're not saying you're going to get rid of fuel oil or indeed, LNG like tomorrow. It is it's a small carbon levy of just a few, like literally a few dollars, that can catalyze something truly sustainable that we're talking about. It's not a shift tomorrow, nor could we actually deliver that massive shift tomorrow. So I think that message and that narrative, which I think Daniel really sort of touched upon, we need to push that a lot more. It's a little bit of money, it's a little levy on on the oil that's being used that can catalyze something truly sustainable. And then finally, I think we need to start thinking about how we link up the national and regional approaches, which have sort of started to crop up. We all know that the EU's Fuel EU Maritime, the EU emissions trading system for shipping, RED 3 in the European Union, that's obviously going to have an outsized impact, and the way those interact with the IMO. Whether it was strategic of the European Union to sort of offer up changing Fuel EU Maritime sort of before the adoption had happened. I'm not sure if that was strategically the best idea, but we do need to sort of now work with what's happening at the regional and national level. And I was thinking a lot about, I sit here in London, and I think a lot about the UK's decarbonisation strategy. There's a line in UK maritime decarbonisation strategy which actually literally says, if the IMO delays action on this, we will implement X, Y, or Z. Now the question is, geopolitics has changed. Will they actually do that? British Prime Minister at last year's UNGA, this was a key line in his UNGA speech. This levy needs to come in one way or another. So yeah, just a few thoughts there, but we are going to be more prepared over the next 12 months, and we need to work together.
Thanks, Joe. AB, I'm just going to bring you in, but I think, Joe, you've raised few incredible points here, and that whole question on the fuels. Let's have another discussion in a couple of minutes, but also on some of the other elements you highlighted. I think there's ample space for a lot of conversations to be had, and for a lot of us to be informed about the various components of this. But AB, with whatever you want to respond to Daniel, Theo, and Joe's remarks, I also want you to speak more about the work that you've done on the registry and certification. Right, that is still another key component that that we need awareness to be spread on. But also, if you could shed more light on how what are the implications and how you're going about this.
Thanks, Nish. And I couldn't agree with what Daniel, Theo, and Joe said anymore. Most of us were all around in the same area and talking about a lot of this over the past 2 weeks. So I think we are in agreement about a lot of this. I just want to highlight one thing that is important for us to consider in addition to everything that's been said. Joe and Theo both highlighted how little the cost is if you look at it from a macro perspective. And that is true, but it's also coming from a slightly more developed country perspective. And I think that there are implications of this for especially least developed countries and SIDS. And for them, this can be material with regards to how much the increase in cost is. And those were a lot of the votes that flipped. Those were the votes that came under pressure and will continue to come under pressure during this political process. So I think that we need to certainly emphasize that in the macro context, costs are going to be not as large as expected, but we also need to emphasize and communicate better what really is in it for LDCs, for SIDS, and for developing and emerging economies. And there's plenty that's there. I mean, we all know the story with regards to India and the tremendous potential that India has with regards to green hydrogen production. The fact that green ammonia is being produced at $600 per ton puts it at the bottom of the merit order curve. India is going to be able to outcompete almost anyone. And you can say that there's similar opportunities for other parts of the world. Namibia, Mauritania, Morocco. There's a number of Ecuador. There's a number of countries that voted to delay this for a year that have substantial opportunities to benefit from this policy. But in addition to that, there also needs to be, I think, better communication of the fact that this does need to be a just and equitable transition, and that the Net Zero Fund and the everything that's being discussed right now within the guidelines hopefully will make it just and equitable, so that you can bring along some of the countries that were maybe on the fence and decided to flip their votes from April. We can't lose sight of that. Nish, on the registries and certifications, this is a topic I can go on and on and on about for quite some time. But I think that I don't know if I can say much more than what Daniel said, other than to say that it can be done, and we've done it. We've shown, I think, that both the registry can be created in a timely-ish period, and that there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from the registries, both that we've created as Mærsk Mc-Kinney Møller Center and RMI, but also others have created. And so those aren't necessarily technical barriers. Those are things that can be easily overcome, and we just need to, again, do a better job of communicating some of this. I think that that's where we've lacked. We've not been able to communicate in a strategic way.
AP, I tried to warn this in a very subtle fashion at the beginning. Most of us are a little unaware. Some of the attendees here, they're all working on the projects, right? The green ammonia and the green methanol projects, and very ignorant about some of these other, intricate aspects. So perhaps if you could share a little bit more about your work, if your team could just drop a link in the chat box, so some of us can have a look at that. I want to come back to Daniel and Theo. Joe highlighted something, the UK did in their policy as well. We've also spoken about EU maritime and its implications. And something I heard from some of the companies was that we'd rather have a global regulatory landscape than regional ones in the shipping sector. So perhaps you could comment on that, and if we again see fragmented regulations coming out of different regions, how does that really affect some of these stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it was part of the discussion also last week. The fact that the IMO is the best placed organization to have global regulations, and then we have already some regional. I mean, we have one region, the EU, with their own regulations, but also some things popping up in other places. Also Africa has started their own carbon pricing, including shipping, and Turkey has started motions in that direction. UK ETS, and so there has been some motions. I think I personally would advocate, and that I think a lot of people. I mean, the member states who have a regional scheme, they were there. Advocating for a global regulation because they know they have this clause of reviewing the EU ETS and the FUU depending what IMO does. I think maybe the clauses that exist today, the EU ETS and the FUU, like as they are, they're not sufficiently strong signals for the rest of the world for them to have confidence that they will not be that they will be pulling back potentially from the EU ETS and FUU if the IMO develops their own regulations. And maybe there's something to be done there. Of course, I don't know how the EU is going to react to that, but they are in the process of reviewing their regulation. They're launching studies to make that review. I would hope that these studies are accelerated a little bit in time so that they can benefit from these 12 months and see and provide some signal if they can. But yeah, I think I would aim. I mean, I started to hear already from some people. Okay, let's put our full focus in regional now and full focus in national. I still think that the best bet is to have global regulations, and these, as CEO said, it's not a defeat. It's still there. Like, there are some legitimate concerns, and we need to work on that to get to the adoption in 12 months, and that's our best bet. That's the best scenario to get that done. So I think that should still be the number one focus for. Yeah, Theo, do you want to add up?
Sure. I see Femke's hand up, but just to take a step back, I'm thinking, Nishant and colleagues on the line, if we're making low emission molecules and somebody said, look, in a year there's going to be a decision about creating a relatively small, but in absolute terms compared to what you're building, giant new market for you, and it's going to be politicized and we have to work out some technical details, you wouldn't say, no, let's not focus on that. Let's think about potential regional schemes that are 5 years away, right? We'd focus on, we'd pick the lowest hanging fruit first. And I think that's what we should continue to do. I'm sorry, Femke, please. I suspect you won't disagree with that, but I'd love to hear your point.
No, I definitely not at all. No, I really want to come in and agree with most of what's been said. Because the reason I just came home from the Global Maritime Forum annual summit, where we brought together over 200 CEOs and other high-level participants from really across the value chain, which really wasn't planned to be right after. I mean, we didn't expect this to happen, so we had some last-minute changes to our program. But I actually think we were a little bit worried about this taking place right before, but I actually think it was a really good thing, right? Because we had the chance to digest a little bit with a lot of our stakeholders. And I think what really came out is that I think everyone understood that there's a huge potential for national regional framework. I don't think there is denying that, both on demand and supply side. I think they really are very, very important in pushing for really kind of that ambition and for acceleration, especially in the kind of the start phase of the transition. But I think what was really striking, we've heard it before, is what many, especially ship owners, highlighted was, it almost doesn't matter how high the price is as long as it's a global price. Because that way, as long as the competition is equal, I mean, I don't know that Air would be so happy to be quoted saying it almost doesn't matter how high the price is, because I'm sure they'll push back on high penalties and high levies. But at least the philosophy around the point is, we need a global framework. We need something that is a global level playing field. And we keep on hearing it over and over again. And I think we just got reminded again of how important this really, really is. And I don't think one has to exclude the other. Of course, there's real importance for the EU to be reviewing its system in light of how the IMO is going to go forward with its framework. But there's still huge potential also for national and for regional framework and for support on both demand and supply side. And one, it's not a zero-sum game. They can both be contributing to the same thing, but play different roles, right? But really, fingers crossed for a global framework, because I think that's really, really very critical at this stage.
Yeah. And I think, Nishant, if I could just add,
sure,
just one very brief point on this is that, building on what Femke is saying, I think a very smart foot forward thing for green industrial policy to do is to say, with one hand, we're going to push for a mechanism that socializes the price of the transition globally, and with the other, we're going to facilitate our domestic production. We saw this with the dovetailing of the IRA and FuelEU Maritime. We'd expect to see it with a net zero framework and many other green industrial packages that countries could unilaterally pass. But it's much easier to eat part of the cost gap and capture those gains than be expected to eat the whole thing.
Before I bring Joe and AP back in, first thing is, it's such a unique opportunity, right? There's no other industry that could so easily be regulated on a global level like maritime. And before we, I also want to acknowledge some of the questions that are coming in the Q&A session. They've been coming in for the last half hour. We will have them. We will start answering your questions very soon, but please keep dropping them in the Q&A box. Joe, AP, before y'all come in, I know Daniel and Theo have to leave in a couple of minutes. So Daniel and Theo, any final, any comments on the fuel space, right? I think, if I have to represent everybody here in the audience, the question is really between green ammonia and green methanol only, right? We're not concerned about the others, but you could tell us, should we be concerned about the other fuels that are in the mix? And between ammonia and methanol, it's always been a race. What's sticking its neck out?
Yeah, my final comment before I leave is that when you are going to the IMO, in the preparation of going to the IMO, we've been talking to different segments of the shipping industry, like shipping segments, like the tankers, the chemical tankers, the containers, the liners, the small, the big, and so on. And then you can hear how important this is, and then in the guidelines we need And then we talk to the fuel producer for different types of molecules. We need these, this is going to be amazing. And in the guidelines we need these, and that for our fuels. But the first step, the common element for all of them is let's get adoption. Of course, there will be differences of opinion when you start developing the guidelines. I prefer reward like these, I prefer reward like that, and that will be normal. Or I prefer the ISA to be like that, the ISA to be like this. And again, that's going to be normal. But the first step is adoption. So I think adoption is bigger than focus on a single part of the industry. The adoption is important for everyone. So my final say is that when I said at the beginning that we need to bring these to a higher level of awareness, there's a sense of doing this together with others that maybe do not think in the same way on the details as you do or as I do. But equally important for me, as equally important for the other person, is to get through adoption. So let's get together for adoption. So I think it's also reaching out to the others and putting aside disagreements that are only the details, but to have the focus of the bigger picture, which is to get through adoption. So an outreach to other types of fuel producers, an outreach to other countries, that's going to be really necessary, I think, to come with a concise and common voice. That's just what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, Daniel's much more eloquent than I am. Maybe just the final point is that once you have adoption, you have refinement, right? But in order for our ministries and our governments to go somewhere and advocate for our molecule, our pathway, our comparative advantage, they need somewhere to do it. And so in addition to adoption, we have the opportunity to update the framework as the years roll by. But you need to have a framework to do that. And so it's not just a one-shot game, but you're betting on a repeated story of multilateral interaction. But it starts, in about a year, hopefully, with a positive outcome. And Nishant, if we host another webinar like this in about a year's time, I hope and anticipate we'll have a much more positive story coming out of London to report on.
No, thanks very much. And, you're free to stay on for the next, couple of minutes as much as you have time and, slowly slip away. Thank you very much, for taking the time out. And you guys have said some, incredible things, a lot of insights, and we will be, quoting you on some of, the statements you've made. We'll definitely run it by you as well. And we do look forward to, having another conversation like this in 1 year's time. But I think we need to have more important conversations between then and now, right? The next 12 months are even more important, like you've highlighted. And I think we'll have to have more focused conversations on the various elements of this. So, Joe, coming on, you raised your hand first. So thank you, guys.
No, thanks, Nish. And of course, I agree that adoption is the key. But if there are some issues that we can resolve prior to adoption that help us get that adoption, then we should absolutely do that. And we have the time to do it. My reflection was actually a little bit about this sort of, it's not going to solve the fundamental challenge that some states have with the issue at hand. There's a fundamental philosophical opposition to it, so that's not going to change. We know that. But selling this sort of advantage of a kind of a global regulatory approach versus national or regional ones is also one that I think we can do well for. And part of the reason I say that is, as a as the green hydrogen organization, we spend a huge amount of our time trying to match and reconcile the national and regional approaches there are to defining green hydrogen, green ammonia, green methanol, e-methane. The EU has its 3 pillars of electricity accounting, including additionality. The Indian National Green Hydrogen Mission doesn't have any of those 3 pillars. Australia has a hybrid sort of version. And one of the biggest barriers, I think, to scale up is this sort of mutual recognition of accounting and certification, and that is a real nightmare. All these different countries have a slightly different way of measuring the accounting, in which they need to use those accounting methodologies to decide what subsidies, what fiscal support to give to clean hydrogen. So if you present this opportunity to get rid of so much of that, like kind of heartache almost, through regulation and through common guidelines, then I think that's a really good thing. Of course, they have to be the right ones. They have to be the ones that do genuinely incentivize the lowest sort of emission and the most scalable sort of solutions. But our experience, as Nish, from green hydrogen standards is, it's a minefield of slightly different approaches all over the world. So this can be a really sort of avant-garde approach.
No, it's very much influenced by geopolitical interests as well, right? And nation state interests too. But AP, please.
Yeah, just I have that exact thing written down, Joe. So you kind of stole my point a little bit, but I think that just to double down, we have a year still. So if we're talking about national and regional frameworks, we can still work on national and regional frameworks in parallel and double down if in a year this is not able to pass. But this year still buys time to try to make it work at an international level. And as we are in parallel working on those national and regional frameworks, they become more of a threat. And that creates more of a headache for exactly the reasons that Joe talked about. And something that we have not mentioned so far is that the majority of ship owners and operators were supportive of the framework, but as we got closer to the time of adoption, increasingly there were a subset of ship owners and operators that were lobbying against it. If they see a set of national and regional frameworks start to come up, which is going to be more of a headache for them to handle, I'm not sure that they're going to be lobbying quite as hard against it next time around. So there's some soul searching that we need to do. There's some work that we need to do in terms of getting our communication, our narrative, and our work lined up in the right way. But I think that there is a lot of opportunity for us to try to come back in a year and try to get this passed and get adopted.
No, very well said. Also, I don't know if Femke, if you have anything you want to respond to what you just heard from all 4 of them, because I want to start bringing in the questions. I think we'll have a lot more to speak then as well. But Femke.
No, fully agree with what's already been said. So happy to stay quiet.
No, it's been a great conversation, and I think we learn a lot more from having a conversation like this than reading articles. And honestly, I've spent hours reading a lot of articles, and what I heard from your opinions, I think it really gives the right perspective. So moving on to the Q&A, of course, this is going to be biased, but let me start from the first with the very first question, which is, where does blue and low carbon ammonia methanol sit in this analysis? Slide 6. This question was for Femke from her presentation.
Yeah, so they were taken into account in the modeling. So the graph itself. So if you're looking at the kind of the ammonia line, the for the total cost of ownership for ammonia, that is a mix of blue switching to green in the kind of the mid 2040s or so. And so it really kind of, for ammonia as a kind of a fuel in itself to be sort of competitive in any way, if you're not counting on the rewards, really just the framework in itself, that's likely to be blue ammonia. That's the kind of the most cost competitive option. This is also based, of course, on assumptions around gas prices, and we don't know how those are going to develop. So it's based on a low gas price outlook, but that is really the only way for ammonia to be competitive in the short term, and that switches to then green ammonia as the GFI targets get so stringent that blue ammonia won't be able to meet those anymore. But blue ammonia will be able to get you to kind of comply and even over comply and sell your surplus units for a really, really long time. And that's how blue ammonia was kind of taken into account. And from methanol, we looked at bio and e-methanol, and here it's the same thing where we kind of switch between those two. But if you're really comparing kind of methanol and ammonia together in terms of like their cost competitiveness, methanol is really a lot more expensive per ton of LSFO equivalent compared to ammonia. Of course, it has different advantages. I think ship owners really that are looking at methanol are looking not just purely at the kind of the cost of the fuel itself, but also at the lower cost of potential new builds, the lower cost of just pure running the vessel itself in terms of crew and insurance and all of that stuff. And just it's easier. It's already out there in a way, in a kind of a more real way than ammonia, and so therefore it feels a little bit kind of, more tangible and more reliable for many ship owners. But that's at least kind of in terms of the total cost of ownership how we took that on board.
Just a note on blue methanol. We've done the numbers on the carbon intensity for blue methanol, and I think we've had this discussion with Youth MK. This is blue methanol is quite unlikely to be attractive under any regulatory regime for ship owners and operators. So I think that it's pretty safe to rule blue methanol out as a potential future fuel. That just wanted to drop that little tidbit in there.
No, from what we heard from Femke, it is really concerning that blue has a space for the next for the short term. Now, but we also heard that methanol would be preferred, and that's what even I've heard from certain pockets as well. And if it's going to be methanol, it'll be green methanol and not blue. So ultimately, I think.
So this is a generalization, right? Like there's definitely ship owners who are also looking at ammonia. So just to highlight that it's not everyone is looking at methanol. It's just when we talk to ship owners for the short term kind of compliance, that seems to be the most kind of reliable option for many. But it is a generalization, and there's definitely ship owners who are very much looking at the ammonia pathway as well. But just to kind of highlight that it's not just cost, right? There's also other elements that come into the decision making for your technology pathway.
I think if I were to dangle something for the green ammonia producers, it would be to say that it's very, very unlikely that blue is going to be able to qualify for the reward. To qualify for the ZNZ reward, you would have to assume zero upstream methane emission leaks. You'd have to assume almost perfect carbon capture and completely renewable energy for the planet itself. It's very, very difficult to qualify for the ZNZ reward threshold using blue ammonia. So that's where green ammonia can potentially outcompete blue ammonia in this framework. And it will come down to sort of what the LCA guidelines are and how the ZNZ rewards play out. So there is certainly potential for scale up of green ammonia, and green ammonia has always been considered the more scalable, least cost option in the long term. And you will see some uptick in the short term, almost certainly. And if this is adopted.
Just to follow up on that, what qualifies as green here, right? Are they going to look at regulations, regional regulations, or as IMO define anything as to what qualifies as green ammonia in terms of carbon intensity or electricity use?
So so that's going to be based on the LCA guidelines, right? And the production pathways and the default factors. What actually kind of how it qualifies again is also up to the LCA guidelines. I guess there's likely going to be discussions around and I'm sure Joe is much more into this than I am, but like time matching and how that differs to, for example, the EU regulations where it's quite stringent, and I'm sure that's also for especially Indian producers a very, very important kind of thing to focus on, and a huge kind of in terms of kind of what it means for keeping your customers, especially in Europe, if you have to choose between like the Net Zero Framework and the EU regulation, for example, but still to be decided, a lot of it.
Joe, if you want to add to that.
No, I mean, I think Femke and AP put it absolutely right. I guess one thing that I'm picking up on a little bit, and don't know if AP and Femke have views on this, is, of course, we're now aware of the work ahead on the guidelines, and there's a lot of them, 14, and there's some very specific ones about life cycle analysis and defining ZNZ, etc. I also receive a sense from some that what will the vote be on if the vote happens in a year's time? Will it be a vote on exactly the same framework with some guidelines that have been resolved? Or will it be a vote on potentially something that is slightly different? Now, I'm hoping that Femke or AP have a good answer to that, but I am picking that up from a few people, and it'd be nice to sort of, maybe it's impossible to say fully, but yeah, that'd be a good question to put to my fellow panelists.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't really trust my crystal ball anymore after last week, so it's difficult to say. But I think it's quite likely to assume there's going to be, like, it's not exactly the same framework, and the main reason why is the dates, right? Like, I think postponing it with a year has implications for the dates, and the dates are substantive changes to the framework. And so, as a minimum, I'm expecting changes to dates that we just have to push up. And whether that means that, you're kind of cracking open the framework and therewith kind of opening up for more debate on more things, I'm sure there will be attempts that will be made. But that's the case. I don't know. It's really, really hard to say. I'm really hoping that we can keep the changes as minimal as possible and just kind of stick to the revisions of the framework as set out, like the RU revisions, for example. They are already planned into the future. I'm hoping we can just keep those discussions for later. But that's, yeah, don't quote me on this in a year from now.
I hope my team's taking notes. So
I think,
yeah. Sorry, please go ahead.
No, let's go into the questions.
Yeah, and thanks, Ujjwal, for that question. It's really, open a lot of discussions. The next one's from Dr. Nisrag Shah from Torrent Power. Will the auction-based rewards be counterproductive in terms of adoption itself?
Is that a question for me based on my presentation, I assume? I'm not sure where that question is coming from. I don't know why it would be. There's no real, I think, unless there's massive opposition to auction-based rewards, but then they would just change the guidelines, right? So I doubt that there's any real link there. I mean, of course, there's pros and cons with everything. People are raising cons against the auction-based rewards as well, but those we'll just have to figure out in the coming half year, coming year, and how to deal with those, really. So not necessarily, I want to say.
I saw your fellow panel, not that.
I agree with Femke, and while Femke was hobnobbing with the CEOs at the Global Maritime Forum Annual Summit, I was in the room while they were discussing some of the guidelines and some of the specific details around ZNZ rewards, which the positive is that they kept on talking about it and that they didn't let the non-adoption derail that. Auctions were brought up. They were not like a bottleneck or a stopper for anyone. It was part of the different options that were discussed. I think everyone is keeping things on the table for the moment, and there will be more discussions about it as we go into April and then into next year. I don't think the auction is what's going to stop adoption.
So again, the next question, I'm sure it's directed at Femke because it came during your presentation. Why will biofuels take away most of the rewards when compared to e-fuels? Is scalability not factored into risking of a biofuel project?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of layers to that question. So kind of figuring out where to start. I think so scalability may be factored into this based on the LCA guidelines. So the LCA guidelines then define kind of the GFI intensity targets, and scalability may be a factor that can be factored into the LCA guidelines. Whether this is going to be stringent enough to actually reflect any scalability constraints, I highly doubt it. So let's kind of assume that it's not factored into the GFI factor. into kind of the emission factor of the different fuels. What you have then is a fuel that, in terms of its emission factor, can actually be quite comparable to e-fuels. It can meet the Z&Z target, and therefore kind of be eligible for rewards. And biofuels are likely to be slightly cheaper, lower. I think it was Theo who mentioned the marginal cost of abatement. Biofuels generally have a lower cost of abatement than e-fuels. And so in a case where you have a fixed reward that is the same for all Z&Z rewards, what is logically going to happen is that as a ship owner, you would go for the fuel that has the lowest marginal cost of abatement, right? Because that's the lowest cost for you to both comply and to get that money for the rewards. And so therefore, a lot of ship owners will then use biofuels to do that, to be eligible for reward. And then there's no real incentive for you as a ship owner to go for a fuel that has a much higher marginal cost of abatement, but that will get you there in 2040, 2050. There's just no real short-term kind of attractiveness of that fuel. And that's why there's a little bit of a risk until kind of then you're kind of waiting for the point to be kind of where biofuels hit that scalability constraint, or they're not as available, and then you're basically betting on that to happen sooner rather than later, before ship owners can go to e-fuels. And I think another point I want to bring up before AP jumps in is that biofuels are, because they have a lower cost of abatement, because they're generally cheaper, they are already kind of what we call indirectly subsidized through the GFI targets. And what I mean by that is that because any other fuels are made more expensive and the targets are kind of stringent, and you have the remedial units, biofuels, especially drop-in biofuels, are going to be the lowest cost compliant fuel because of those targets and because of the RUs. And they're already kind of made the lowest cost compliant fuel, and that's an indirect subsidization for those fuels. And therefore they don't need additional subsidization or additional rewards. But then let's keep those rewards for the fuels who have a higher cost and who don't have that kind of benefit. And again, that's not to say that we need to pick a winning fuel. It's not about picking a winning fuel. It's about making sure that all of those fuels that can be part of the transition, that they're on the same competitiveness level, that they can compete with each other. And then from there on, the sector can kind of figure it out themselves, right? So it's not about picking a winning fuel, it's the opposite. It's about allowing the shipping sector to actually be able to pick a winning fuel based on, market development and market maturity.
AP, you want to add to that?
Yes, and I feel bad, Joe. Please do jump in. But I think a couple of nuance points that are not in disagreement, but maybe as additional considerations. Largely, biofuels are cheaper compared to most production. However, and this is where it gets really exciting for India, if we're going by the $600 per ton tender that was put out, that gets pretty close to biofuels B100, so like biofuel at 100% out of Singapore. Those numbers are pretty close right now if we're assuming that the tenders are correct. So there is a path for competitiveness with some of the hydrogen drive fuels, especially from India, China, and some of the better production locations. I think important to highlight that. And so it's not that bio is always going to beat out hydrogen production in certain locations. Hydrogen could beat it out. The other thing is that there could be potential for bio to be used as blends to meet compliance rather than be used at 100% to get the Z&Z rewards. And that could end up diluting some of the uptake from biofuels of the rewards. Third point is that there is a variety of feedstocks used for bio. Some of those feedstocks definitely will not qualify for the Z&Z reward, others will. So there is a variation of which biofuels could qualify for the reward and which couldn't. So agree largely with what Femke is saying, but there's some, I think, additional nuances in there that we will start to see play out if this is adopted and if we see it, if we see like market reality start to shape some of this.
Yeah, it's not just about the cost, right? It's also about just kind of pure like level of commitment. For example, like e-fuels will require you as a ship owner to commit to 15 years, whereas biofuels and drop-in will leave you with optionality. So it's also just a matter of kind of like flexibility, and there's like very many considerations here for why it's important to kind of make sure they're really competitive.
Agreed.
So the next question, very simple. Why did India and China vote for this delay? AP,
My crystal ball is still broken.
You speak to the government a lot, don't you, Nish?
Well, I thought I was
in
a
India.
moderator. But I'll share my perspective. I'll share what I've been hearing. But I'd love to hear from you guys first.
Joe, you might be on safer ground expressing your views here.
Yeah, I mean, listen, geopolitics played a big part in what was happening. We saw what was happening on oil exports and tariffs at exactly the same time between certain big producers, around the world. We know that, it happened in exactly the same week that sort of various concessions were made, and, deals are done, in this way. For China, which I genuinely believe does want this framework, and I absolutely wouldn't dare to sort of second guess, the sort of the reason for them to support the delay. But I think they probably looked closely at some of the detail, and I do wonder whether like resolving some of these questions on life cycle analysis, on ZNZ fuels, will give a country that takes these things very seriously, as all countries should, just that little bit of extra sort of confidence to get it over the line next time. So again, I think it points to, let's get these things right as well as we can, and sort of remove every bit we're capable of removing of a reason to say no to the framework. There's some things we're incapable of removing, but let's remove the ones that we are capable of.
AP, what are the whispers in the corridors?
I'm sorry, could you say that again, Nish?
What are the whispers in the corridors in London about China and India?
Well, you can't trust the whispers in the corridors. There's a lot of misinformation out there, so you have to be careful about what you believe. I think that Joe's right about the geopolitics here, and we should be careful about speculating too much, but I think that some dots can probably be connected with regards to trade, tariffs, and positions that were taken by certain geopolitical poles. So yeah, I think that it doesn't take a lot to connect the dots.
I think that was a very diplomatic way to put it. And I also echo that dots can be connected, number one. Number two, there was a lack of awareness with certain stakeholders as well, as much as, if the dots were connected, we could have got this through. But the dots are connected, and there was also, lack of awareness with some of the other stakeholders. But what I can unwaveringly tell you that is that the maritime sector in India, the government agencies in the maritime sector, they all want this, right? Of course, there are small pockets of concern.
Yeah, 100%.
Ship owners or the leasers, everybody has different concerns, but largely as a group, yes. And the rest of us in the energy sector, we all want this to happen. As much as, it still feels like it's far off. I can still see so many of my member companies still staying in the audience. And I know that these teams are working hard to build their capacities to really understand and serve this market. So yeah, I think, to that
just
question,
on that point, Nish, like we've been working with the Ministry of Shipping on a lot of their thinking with regards to developing green shipping corridors or developing the ports to be able to serve both as export hubs and potentially bunkering hubs down the line. The amount of work that's gone in across the board has been immense. There's clear momentum for this. India Maritime Week is coming up next week. RMI is involved with the ministry and others doing a Green Maritime Day. Like, this is something that the industry, that the ministries all seem to want. And hopefully we're able to get the right geopolitical conditions for that to come true in about a year or so. But there's a lot of excellent work that's been done across the board to try to capitalize on the opportunity here.
The next question, what's the current industry benchmark for cost per ton of green ammonia and green hydrogen? I think we can skip that. What's the fate of EU RFNBO? So there, I don't know if you all understood that question, or do you want me to get Sudhir to expand it? Or was that already discussed?
What's the fate of EU RFNBO? Was that the question?
Yes.
The EU RFNBO framework is in place. The European Commission has said it'll look at its overall hydrogen strategy towards the end of 2026. And there is a big push from some parts of industry to relax some of those requirements, but at the moment there's no commitment from the European Commission to change those. Maybe one point of information might be interesting for panelists is there's another sort of methodology delegated act in the EU which regulates low carbon hydrogen. So that's hydrogen derived from fossil gas, potentially from nuclear as well. And that was not opposed yesterday by the European Parliament, which means unless the European Council comes in and opposes it, then I think on the 8th of November, that delegated act will become law. So there's a bit more regulatory certainty for both blue and green at the moment. It'll be interesting to see if the pressure settles down a little bit, given that.
Thanks, Joe. I was expecting the question to be, on EU RFNBO and its relationship with IMO and these fuels, but I think it was a very simple question, and I think you gave a great answer. So with that, no more questions in the Q&A, but I want to bring something that we are doing to everybody's attention. And of course, all the panelists you saw here, their organizations are also part of it. You must have seen a little logo that was there next to the agenda. If Abhinav, if you can bring that up. Abhinav, if you can bring that slides up. So in the meantime, there is clearly a gap between both the sectors, and I think the future is all of us coming together. Number two is we've clearly seen one of the key messages here was to spread that awareness and also level up. And in light of all of this, we've established something called the Green Ports and Shipping Network, which is our effort to bring in everybody across both ecosystems together. And there are a lot of us for whom these ecosystems are common. And this reflects in my conversations with all the DFIs, be it EIB, World Bank, ADB, IFC. They're also interested in the same spaces, right? And I think some of the consumers of these green fuels, they've been a little far away over the last couple of years. We've been closer to the chemical industry and the refinery industry as green hydrogen stakeholders. So to bridge all of these opportunities and also support existing work undertaken by RMI, Mærsk, GMF, we want to support some of the activities they're doing, give them a platform as well. So, the work that they are doing has a larger impact. So this is why you will see something called the Green Ports and Shipping Network. We shortened that to GPSN. We'll be announcing that very shortly. And if you read the concept note, you will see we're not going to be announcing new working groups. We're not going to be doing anything new, but we're going to do our best to leverage the work that everybody else is doing, bridge this gap between both our sectors, and also continue supporting the governments and all other government agencies, not just in India, but globally. Membership is free today. If you'd like your organization to be a part of it, please just write to us on LinkedIn or anywhere else. We will be very happy to bring you in. So Abhinav, if you have that slide up. Okay, Abhinav's got something coming up. One last thing is that...
Can you see the slide, Nish? Is it visible now?
Lovely. You can go to slide 3 and go to presentation, please. Well, we've heard some of the larger facts about the opportunities in the maritime sector for us. Next slide, please. Okay, so the 5% of the 5%, that's, I don't know if the numbers are right. I'm sure, AP and FMK would have something more precise, or comments on it, because I figured that it's not easy to determine an exact figure, but it's roughly around 30 million tons of ammonia or methanol by 2030, and that number goes up significantly by 2040. So, everything here on this slide is exactly what I was talking about. We've already been part of some of these conversations with the ports in Europe, the ports in India, the green corridors that are going on, that are looking to be established. RMI is also working, on the very topic. So that again, a lot of synergies for us to come together and join forces. Next slide. So the next slide gives you an overview of some of our existing networks, our members, and some of them have already agreed to join this Green Ports and Shipping Network. And we hope to bring in at least 100 different organizations because this is a global play. It's not regional. All of us are connected, and we're all in the same fishbowl. So whatever efforts we take, we should be supporting each other. So with that, next slide, please. We have a very simple way to reach out to us. You have a LinkedIn page as well, just GH2 India. We're quite active on that. If you write to our email addresses, we'll get back to you. And that's our website as well. Finally, the government of India's Ministry for New and Renewable Energy is hosting its Green Hydrogen Conference on the 11th and 12th of November. So if you're around, that'll be a good opportunity for us to network and also connect. We'll be announcing a slew of activities under this new platform. And I think we've got a lot of topics out of this conversation, right? We've identified a lot of these key milestones that came from Femke leading up into the next 12 months, something from Daniel, Theo, and AP. We've heard some of the nuances in this framework that we should bring clarity on. And I think Joe also has given some very insightful perspectives. So with that, I want to thank all three of you all, for taking your time out. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And I'm sure, some of the audience who stuck around until this very end thoroughly enjoyed this as well. So on behalf of everybody here at GH2 India, I want to extend my gratitude to all of y'all. And I think, we hope to see more of y'all in the next 12 months and also further. Thank you very much. And everyone else, thank you and good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, Nish. Thank you.
All the best.